All right. Hello, guys. I was, lazy is a strong word, but I did, uh, I did not record this lecture on Friday at school like I had planned, so I'm recording it at my house. If you hear Brenda the bird in the background, or Archer, or any of my various other pet children, please disregard that. But today, first of all, hopefully you had a lovely weekend. And welcome to Unit 5, which is exciting. This is one of my favorite ones. We're talking about agriculture and sustainable agricultural practices and the effects of large-scale farming and all kinds of very cool things. Well, I think they're very cool. If you don't think they're very cool, that's okay. Most people probably don't. But we're just going to dive into it because this is a relatively long lecture. So we will just dive right in. And obviously, I will share these slides with you, and I will share the A+ College Ready voiceover as well, so that you have a couple of different perspectives if you would like a different one. So to start, agriculture. It's just the practice of farming, right? We probably already knew that or could have come up with something similar to that. If you want a more complicated, a little bit more in-depth definition of that, it's the cultivation of the soil for growing crops and rearing animals to provide food, wool, and other products. So it's not just crops necessarily. Agriculture also includes animals, important to note. And agriculture has a major impact on the environment. That might not be something you think about right off the bat, but it does. It definitely does. Even something as small as the greenhouse that I'm doing at the school, that has an impact on the environment. Just about everything that we do agriculturally has some sort of impact, whether it be positive or negative. The three main crops that are grown around the world are wheat, rice, and corn. The use of grain, or corn specifically, as an energy source in ethanol has contributed to rising costs of that particular crop, which can lead to hunger due to poverty. So if you've ever been at the gas station and you see a sticker or something along those lines that says no more than 10% ethanol, that's because a lot of companies have started cutting their gasoline with ethanol because it makes it cheaper, makes the gasoline cheaper, and it doesn't cost them as much. But in turn, that makes corn itself more expensive, which does lead to higher levels of food insecurity due to poverty around the world. So you can kind of see that total and per capita amount here of the global grain production. It has gone way up over the past, 40, 50 years. So there are a few different types of agriculture that we're going to dive into. First off, you got industrialized agriculture. This is going to be the one, I would argue at least, the one that has the most negative effect on the environment. Industrialized agriculture, sometimes we'll refer to it as large-scale agriculture as well. So this is going to be what does provide most of the world's food. It uses heavy equipment, which obviously means you're going to use a lot of fossil fuels, gas-powered equipment. It uses heavy amounts of fertilizers and pesticides, and it is generally to create high-yield monoculture crops. So that's when you're only planting one crop over and over and over again in the same area. The second type that you have is plantation agriculture. This one is generally going to be mostly used in developing countries. And generally it's used to grow cash crops, which are going to be things like coffee, sugarcane, bananas, and cacao, which is where we get our chocolate. It does require a large input of fertilizers and pesticides, so that's a lot of nitrogen and other chemicals that are being put out into the environment there. And it's often located on cleared land. And when they say that, what they generally mean is it's an area where tropical forests, or the rainforest specifically, has been clear cut. And then once they've clear cut it, they use that land for this plantation style agriculture. Because in those tropical forest areas, obviously you've got high heat, high humidity, you've got tons of sunlight, consistent temperature all year round. So if you're trying to make a lot of money, you're trying to grow a lot of the same product, coffee, sugarcane, whatever, you're trying to grow it really quick, then the equator, the tropical rainforest, would be a great place to do it because you've got just like a year-round growing season, basically. And now the third one is traditional agriculture. It's also sometimes called subsistence agriculture. And this is going to be when only one family is basically growing things for themselves. So if you got a family, they're like simple farming family. They're just providing for their own foods, or for their own food for their family. And generally, they want to have enough left over to where they can trade it or sell it to make sure that they are making some money in the household as well. This particular type of agriculture, I would say at least, has the least negative effect on the environment, especially depending on how much fertilizer or pesticide that particular family uses for their crops. And it also generally is going to rely on hard work from humans and draft animals. Maybe they've got a tractor or two, but for the most part, this one is not going to be industrialized in the same way that first type is. Next, we got slash and burn agriculture. You've probably heard about this in history class before, if I had to guess. This one is rough. This one is, I don't know if I would like to see someone's argument for or against slash and burn versus industrialized being the worst for the environment, because they're both pretty darn bad. With slash and burn agriculture, essentially you cut as much of the foliage and the greenery in the area down as you can, and then you light it all on fire. And so they burn. This generally happens in rainforests or on the equator, and it clears land for either crops or cattle. And because in the tropical rainforest, the soil actually isn't that nutritious, because of that, even more land is necessary than it would be in a normal area. So that's our first little section down with these different types of agriculture. Next up, we've got the Green Revolution. And now I hear the Green Revolution and I get excited because I'm like, oh, that sounds like something that's good for the environment. Not so much. Not really. It's kind of a misnomer, if you ask me. But it's a name that was given to a set of advanced agricultural practices that really, really highly increased crop yields after World War II. And so what they mean by that, crop yields, it increased the amount of successful crops they were getting from each growing season. And there's 3 different strands that we can break this down into. You've got 2 different types of change that occurred. You've got the innovations, and then you've got the consequences. So the innovations that happened, biochemical, we had things like hybrid seed selection. People started using fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides. So they were increasing the nitrogen content so their plants would grow more. They were using herbicides to get rid of weeds, and then pesticides to get rid of any bugs or anything like that they were dealing with at the time. And what that resulted in was obviously increased yields, weeds and pests were controlled, increased costs for farmers, and possible environmental degradation. Not great. On the mechanical side of things, you had things like diesel and electric pump-powered irrigation, so that means that they were able to water their crops mechanically now. It didn't have to be as tedious as doing it by hand. Because of this, the water supply is controlled, there's less labor needed, increase in arable area, so that just means area that can be used, and increased access to markets. So then socially, there were things like land reforms, loans, changes in distributive system. So basically, it was easier for poor farmers to be able to get the things they needed, like better seeds, farms were consolidated, things like that. So you can see again here, developed countries obviously had the biggest increase in their yields after the Green Revolution. So if we want to break it down into the 5 main points that the Green Revolution resulted in, you got the development of high-yielding monoculture crops. And again, we said that monoculture means they're growing one crop in that area. Use of large amounts of inorganic fertilizer, so it's not natural, so it's not organic, inorganic fertilizer. Heavy use of pesticides, intensive irrigation or watering techniques, and the development of strategies to allow multiple crops to grow on the same plot of land. Some of those strategies included mechanization, using more machines, genetically modified organisms or GMOs, fertilization, irrigation, and use of pesticides. Like we said, mechanization of farming, they use machinery to complete these tasks. It increases the yield, it increases profits and the efficiency for farms, and it also, unfortunately, increases the use of fossil fuels. So some examples of those things. You can see these massive different fossil fuel using things that they utilize on farms at this point. Something I want to touch on is GMOs, genetically modified organisms. These are a highly contested topic. Like, people get really up in arms when you start talking about these. And if I'm being completely honest, I haven't really formed an opinion on them yet. But what it is, it's when an organism is produced by copying genes from a species with a desirable trait and inserting them into another species. So some of those desirable traits that farmers obviously want in their crops are going to be things like repelling frost, means that they're going to be more frost resistant, repelling pests, so they won't have as much pest or insect damage, and nitrogen fixation, so being able to utilize nitrogen better and grow more quickly. So to break it in a little further, obviously humans have been crossbreeding plants for centuries. If you think back to biology, and you probably learned about Punnett squares and Gregor Mendel, and he realized that you could make pink flowers if you mix together red and white ones, right? So we've been crossbreeding plants for a long time, but developing genetically modified ones was a way more targeted and more specific process. This might be a little blurry. Hopefully you guys can see it okay, but it says GMOs are living beings that have had their genetic code tweaked in some way. And so what happens is a gene is inserted into the DNA of a single cell, and as that cell divides and multiplies in identical ways, obviously that gene is going to be in every single cell. Genetically modified technology isn't only for crops. It can be used on microorganisms like bacteria. It has created medicines like insulin and vaccines. So some advantages of genetically modified organisms: you've got insect resistance, herbicide resistance, so you can use stronger weed killers without killing your plants. Virus resistance, delayed fruit ripening, altered oil content, and pollen control. Some of the disadvantages are going to be things like pests and weeds that could evolve resistance to the genetically engineered genes. So this would result in the GMOs not being quite as effective as they would have been previously. And those genes could also contain allergens that could be transferred to other plant species. So fertilization, another one of those big changes that happened during the Green Revolution. It provides additional nutrients, which obviously is going to increase yields. And also, on the negative side of things, using more fertilizer does lead to fertilizer runoff into waterways, resulting in eutrophication and hypoxia. So essentially that nitrogen from the fertilizer leaks into local waterways, and it can result in things like algal blooms. It can choke out local wildlife. It's not great. Oh, and here's the breakdown of that. Nitrogen coming into the water supply causes an increase in phytoplankton, and then eventually oxygen gets way too high in that area. The algae die, algal bloom. It's not great. Next up, we had irrigation. This is just providing water to agricultural areas that are not close to rivers or ponds. This allows way larger amounts of area to be used and increases the yields. And in the U.S., at least, this uses irrigation for crops, uses about 60% of our freshwater supply. So you can see examples of different irrigation methods here where they're pumping the water in to water these crops. Furrow irrigation, which is what that right here is, involves cutting furrows, which is basically just like a little ditch between the rows of crops and filling them with water. This is only about 65% efficient, and the drawback there is evaporation and runoff is pretty high. There's the example again. You've also got flood irrigation, which is where you literally just flood an entire field and let the water soak into the soil evenly. This is about 70 to 80% efficient. Some of the drawbacks: evaporation and runoff still, and waterlogging may occur where some areas get way too waterlogged for the crops to grow successfully. So you can see an example of that here. You've also got drip irrigation, which is over 95% efficient. Unfortunately, this one is expensive. And evaporation and runoff, again, are some issues, but not quite as much as the other ones. And basically, it's just, it's kind of exactly what it sounds like. Smaller amounts of water delivered to soil through pipes. And you can see here, it's literally just like a tiny little drip of water. And this happens for every plant that is planted. Now, spray irrigation is where water is pumped from a well and it's sprayed across the whole field. This consists of numerous metal frames rolling on wheels that extend large water pipes out over the crops. And the low-pressure sprinklers deliver water. If you've driven through farmland in Alabama, you've probably seen these before. They're pretty common here. This one can be anywhere from 75 to 95% efficient, and the drawbacks are that it is more expensive and it uses more energy. All right, let's pick him back up. You've got spray irrigation, which we just talked about. Like I said, you're going to see these all over Alabama. Maybe not quite this big, but I have seen a couple that are about this size. So these are massive, and they can roll through the field pretty easily and water everything as needed. They're expensive, and they use more energy. So something to think about. And you can see examples of this right here in the way that these work. They aren't just necessarily these right here. You've also got large circular ones like this, where you're going to have it rotating and watering as it goes in a circle here. So there are different types. So some problems that can be caused by irrigation are waterlogging, salinization, which we're going to talk about further this week, and aquifer depletion. Waterlogging is going to occur when way too much water is left and it sits in the soil, and it results in the water table of groundwater raising up way higher than it needs to be. This is going to stop the plant's ability to absorb oxygen through their roots, and the plants will eventually die. Salinization is when the salts in the groundwater remain in the soil after the water has evaporated. So basically, balanced system right here. The land hasn't been cleared. After the land is cleared and irrigation starts, the evaporation and irrigation seepage concentrates the salt in the groundwater at the surface. So that salt that was down here on this side gets raised higher and higher, and eventually it percolates up to the top. That salt is at the very surface, and the soil becomes toxic to plants. Aquifer depletion is when, if one particular aquifer it gets depleted if it's overused for agricultural irrigation. So you can see in the Ogallala, we're going to go with that, the Ogallala aquifer, it covers quite a bit of the central U.S. over here. It's in like a few different states over here, all in the Midwest. And let's see, it says underlies 450,000 square kilometers in the central U.S., including parts of Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, Texas, Colorado, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Wyoming, which is wild. And it looks like the loss per year is pretty significant. You can see the water levels are going down in each of these areas because that water is being utilized for crops in that area. And that is all we have for this one. I know this one was a little bit longer. I hope that you followed along with your student notes. As always, if you have any questions, just shoot me an email and I will message you back when I can. I hope you guys have a lovely day.